Okay, so to continue with page 16, we're going to look at these ride symbol exercises at the bottom, okay? So the ride symbol exercises at the bottom introduces a new note on the stave, okay? So when you look at the ride symbol, you'll see it's an X like the hi-hat, but it's actually, instead of sitting on top of the line's going through it. So look carefully at that, the line's going through it, yeah? But then, just to make things even more confusing, there is another way of writing the ride symbol, which is the same as the hi-hat, with the X on top of the line, but if it says RC above it, then it means it's a ride symbol and not a hi-hat. Now this is the thing about music, is there's different conventions, different ways of writing things. So you might see both of these, which is why it's explaining to you that it could be either or, okay? So anyway, we're going to try and play the exercise. The first exercise should be a breeze. It goes like this. Now look how I'm hitting the ride symbol, okay? I'm using the tip and I'm using it about a third of the way in. You can play the ride in all different parts. We can play the bell. And we can play further out to get different sounds. But for a general rule, go a third of the way in with the tip, okay? The next exercise is a groove you already know, which is bass and snare and bass, bass, snare and, but you're playing it on the ride for the first time. So here we go, try to play it with me. 2, 3, 4. Page 16 is done, okay? So now we're going to look at the crash cymbal, which I'm sure you're all very excited about because it's the big noisy crash cymbal, okay? I've got an extra big one on here. It's called 18-inch crash ride. So this one's a bit interesting because you can use it as both a crash or a ride. But looking at page 17, the crash cymbal, we'll notice that the way it's written is it's floating on its own ledger line, okay? So it's a cross with a circle around it, and it floats up on its own line, which is called a ledger line, okay? It's a groove you already know, bass and snare and bass and snare and then there's some crashes with bass drum, okay? I think for this one, we're just going to try and play it together, okay? So here we go, after 4. This is the first line. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if you need to say it, because you're struggling with that one, a lot of people rush through the rests. Okay, don't rush through the rests. Let's try and say it together. So here we go. Saying, okay? Bass and snare and bass and snare and crash, rest, rest, snare. Bass and snare and bass and snare and crash. 2, 3, 4. Crash, snare, rest, snare, crash, snare, rest, snare, crash, snare, rest, snare and crash. Okay, the next exercise, exercise 3 and 4, we're introducing the LV mark, which is also known as the laissez-vibrer mark, stands for laissez-vibrer, which just means you let the cymbal ring on, okay? So you'll see this little line coming off, which is called the LV mark. You've got the note, and then you've got this shape. That just means that even though there's a rest after the note, the cymbal rings on, okay? Don't worry too much about it. Here we go, it's exercise, lines 3 and 4 on page 17. 1, 2, 3, 4. you see I stopped it with my hands there. Shouldn't really have done that because I'm meant to let it ring on, okay? So that's the difference. If I grab it, I'm stopping it, yeah? Let's just try and say those together in case you're struggling. So we'll say line 3 on page 17. 1, 2, 3, 4. Bass and snare and bass and snare and bass, rest, rest, rest. Bass and snare and bass and snare and bass, rest, rest, rest. Bass and snare, bass, bass and snare and crash, rest, rest, rest. Tea, tea, coffee, tea, crash. Okay? And then that's page 17 done. Remember to say it while you're playing it if you're struggling, and you can always rewind the video. Now, we were talking about letting the cymbal ring on. This time we're not going to let the cymbal ring on, because on page 18 we're talking about choking the cymbal, okay? Now, choking the cymbal means stopping the sound really quick, okay? So, if you look at the top of the page, we've got a bass drum and a crash, and we're going to choke it. I want you to grab your stick like this in your left hand and put out these 2 fingers and this thumb, and you're going to grab the cymbal after you've hit it. So it goes like this. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. Let's try it together. 3, 4. On the next line, if you look carefully, you'll notice there's 2 LV marks, which means let the cymbal ring on. Remember this shape. And then there's 3 chokes, okay? So it's showing you how to do both in succession, so one after the other. Here we go. This one you're supposed to play forte, which means loud. So let's give it a go. That last bit, it's crash, rest, choke, choke, choke. So if you see my hand, choke, choke, choke. I'm grabbing it just after. Let's try that together.